Okay, if I can have your attention, please. I'd like to welcome you all to a very important press conference where we hope to update some of our work at Western with our partners across the country looking at domestic homicides. I'm Peter Jaffe. I'm a professor here in the Faculty of Education and the Academic Director for the Center for Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. I represent a large team. I just want to introduce the Management Committee members with that team. Annalee Stratman, our project manager, Julie Poon, who's our National Research Coordinator. Myrna Dawson is out of the province today, but she's a professor in criminology at the University of Guelph, and she's a co-director of the project. This project that I'm going to be talking about today is possible because of a $2.2 million grant from SSHRC that we got back in 2015, and it ends in 2021. So today is really a progress report trying to reinforce some of the important findings to date. Annalee is going to do the land acknowledgement.
Hello, everybody. We celebrate the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. Please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands. And in particular, we acknowledge the Attawandaron, the Algonquin, and the Haudenosaunee. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. And we also recognize the historic contributions of the Métis, the Inuit, and other Indigenous people have made, both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and our province and country as a whole. As settlers, we commit to making the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across our country.
Just a quick overview about our project. We have 12 co-investigators that represent 11 different universities across the country. I know it's one of our co-investigators, Jordan Fairburn. Jordan, if you want to wave, professor at King's in sociology. I'm not sure, Annalee, any other co-investigators in the room? Don't want to leave anybody out. 46 collaborators, 37 partner organizations, 30 research assistants and graduate students, and our management team that I've already introduced. So our goal at the end of the day is to prevent domestic homicide by learning as much as we can about the risk factors that lead up to the homicides, and also how to develop better evidence-based risk assessment, safety planning, and risk management strategies. The grant focuses on 4 vulnerable populations: Indigenous people, immigrant and refugees, rural, remote, and northern communities, and children exposed to domestic violence who also may become homicide victims. Just as an overview, I can't tell you all the names of the partners, but on our website we list the partners, but we're very fortunate to have partners from coast to coast to coast. And today, obviously we're here together in London. There's a simultaneous news conference being held in Yellowknife, Winnipeg, University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, Concordia University in Montreal. So we're very pleased to have co-investigators across the country who are also engaged with their local partners. All of you are already familiar with the definitions of the terms domestic violence and domestic homicide. For those of you not as familiar, domestic homicide refers to anyone killed in the context of an intimate relationship. One of the things that we often don't think about is that sometimes it can be third parties who are also killed in the context of domestic violence. And we know from our research about 20% of domestic homicide victims are third parties who may include children and other family members, and sometimes interveners. We've had cases across the province where police officers have been killed in response to domestic homicide. So anyone who loses their life in the context of violence in an intimate relationship is included in our population. You have folders in front of you with infographics, and you won't be able to read any of these numbers clearly, but one of the things that we wanted to announce today as part of this press conference is the problem is not going away, that we're seeing consistent pattern of a high rate of domestic homicides across the country. As between the years 2010 and 2018, there were 662 victims of domestic homicide across Canada. So we're looking approximately 75 people lose their lives a year, and approximately a domestic homicide every 5 days in Canada. And these numbers are thought to be underestimates because we don't always fully capture the nature of intimate relationships, which may not have been disclosed to the police or to the coroner or medical examiner involved in the investigation. So we're currently looking at collecting, obviously, these important data from media reports, from court reports, and we're now working with 7 coroners and medical examiners and waiting for a final contract with several others. So we're trying to get the official numbers because if we don't count them, it doesn't count. And we're trying to make it really clear that there's too many lives being lost. And at the outset, it's hard to do justice, and I'm even doing an infographic to try to capture this. The numbers don't do justice to the individual lives that have been lost, individual family lives that have been shattered. The context, obviously, this is not a gender-neutral crime. We're looking at domestic homicide for the most part. We're looking at women who were killed by male partners, current or former. We're looking at the vulnerable populations that are part of our research. 52% of the victims represent one of the vulnerable populations, and 23% belong to 2 or more. As I mentioned, we're looking approximately at 8% of all the homicide victims are children who are killed in the context of domestic violence. And we do see variability across the country in terms of the level of rates, which are often associated with more rural, remote northern communities, and obviously the high risk within Indigenous communities. One number is one too many, one is too many, and it's important that whenever we talk about these numbers that we put this in the context of real people and real lives. And our work here is really dedicated to learning from every tragedy. In the same way that people investigate an airplane crash and look for the black box, they know they can't bring back the passengers from the plane that's gone down, but they'll be damn sure that they're going to identify whatever the issues were with the weather conditions, with the aircraft, with pilot training to make sure that future deaths don't occur in similar circumstances in the future. So we're always strengthened and inspired by the people who live behind these numbers and have suffered these losses. Today I'm really pleased to welcome Alison Irons, who lost her daughter Lindsay over 6 years ago, and has many lessons that she'd like to share about what happened with her daughter and the things that we could do individually and collectively to prevent these tragedies. Alison?
Thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here this afternoon to speak about my daughter, Lindsay, and what we all need to do together as a Canadian society to curb domestic violence. Lindsay was killed, as Peter mentioned, on April 5th, 2013 in Bracebridge, Ontario, where she was attending a small campus of Nipissing University, which is now closed. So Muskoka, as many of you may know, is considered a rural environment, and Bracebridge is a small town, and Lindsay wanted to go to a small campus where there was a small class size and so forth. I am an ex-police officer. I was actually served in the RCMP for 9 years in the very early days of women in the force. And I can tell you, when Peter mentions, 6 years ago to me, it's yesterday. 40 years ago, I was working in this field, and I was on the board of a women's shelter in North Vancouver, British Columbia. And yet 40 years later, here we are. I know the problem. I know quite a bit about guns, and unfortunately I've had to learn a lot more about them since my daughter was killed. So the point I'm trying to make there is that domestic violence crosses all socioeconomic sectors, race, religion, culture, education levels, and so forth. My daughter grew up in a middle-class family because my policing career allowed us to live that way. My daughter's killer also grew up in a rural environment. Lindsay didn't initially. He grew up in a rural environment where hunting and guns was part of the culture, north of Kingston, Ontario, in South Frontenac County. In my view, he actually was granted a license and guns he never should have been allowed to have. He actually hid parts of his past from my daughter, and I actually only found out the details of that after my daughter's murder because I investigated it myself. Peter mentioned that part of the problem we have is that in rural homes, as in Muskoka, as in north of Kingston, as in any remote rural or northern community, guns are often part of the culture. And women and children who live in homes where they're experiencing abuse are often, research has proven this, are actually more terrified or even more at risk because of the prevalence of guns in those homes. And in fact, research has also shown that the gun is often used to terrify the woman. And you can just imagine that scenario. Sometimes in the States they've found that the gun being cleaned deliberately in front of the woman is used to terrify her. So I want to make that very clear. The other thing I should mention is that as a police officer and having worked in this field, I was actively talking to my daughter, and this was an on and off again relationship. I was actively speaking with my daughter about the risk factors 3 weeks before her murder. The problem was neither she nor I had any idea of the degree to which his anger against her for having left him completely had escalated. So even the OPP told me there was absolutely no way that anybody could have interfered with the plan that he had. But I want to make it very clear, and this is important for parents and family members and friends everywhere, we need to have those conversations. You need to be actively talking with your children or your family members if you see some of the red flags apparent. My daughter's killer actually had a history of attempted suicide or threatened suicide, which his family ignored. And was never disclosed to the police or anything else, and his guns were never removed from the home. So there were red flags all over the place in my daughter's case. The only other thing I want to add to that is if you have a child in your home or a family member in your home that is having issues with mental health, what I call disinhibited anger about the breakup of a relationship, you need to be having conversations with that person as well, and you need to take a hard, serious look at the picture and determine what resources and help is available in the community and access that help and resources. In finishing, I just want to say I'm very grateful for the work that is being done here. I'm grateful to be a part of this project. I'm very sad to have to see my daughter's face there up on the screen, because I can tell you the minute I saw it, I started to cry. I have a bracelet I'm wearing, and on it has her name, and it says, "I was here, I lived." And those words came from what was the 2012 United Nations Humanitarian Day song that was sung by Beyonce, and it was called "I Was Here." And my daughter worked in the field of helping people with developmental and intellectual disabilities. She was a humanitarian, and she was here. She is not simply a statistic. And I am sick and tired after 40 years of dollars and education, police training, Crown training, all the training in the world. And here we are talking today at a press conference about how many women, children, living in remote communities, LGBTQ people, Indigenous women, ethnic minority women, racial minority women, disabled persons, and so on, are living with domestic violence. So I will do whatever I need to do to keep speaking out so that we can make positive change and start to see this problem reduce in our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison, for sharing your story. I got a chance to meet Allison recently, and we had so many connections in so many different ways, and so it's been great getting to know you. I'm sorry that we have to meet because of this, but thank you so much for being so brave to be here to share that story. I couldn't imagine doing it myself. We have another person's reflections as well, and Maha El-Barani is a young woman whose mother was killed as well in 2012, and she's going to share a few reflections. Now, unfortunately, she can't be here in person, but she did agree to provide a video for us.
I am Maha El-Barani. I grew up here in London, Ontario, from the age of 2 until 25. I now work in humanitarian aid with Syrian refugees in Lebanon. I am a domestic homicide survivor, at least that's what the journal articles call me, and I will be sharing with you some insights on an immigrant's perspective and experience with language, cultural, and other barriers that make it more difficult to report domestic violence and access services. This is my dear and sweet mama, Sonia. She was murdered by my father in April 2012 after 29 years of oppression and abuse. I would like to introduce you to Mama by quoting my older sister. Mama was beautiful inside and out. Her eyes were the color of emerald jewels, and they sparkled through all the pain they carried. Her skin was so soft, and her hands were so elegantly beautiful. She was a teacher early in her career, and later went back to college part-time, while working full-time to get a diploma in early childhood education at the age of 49. She then shifted careers and became a daycare worker, helping many mothers to raise their young children. 6 months before she was killed, she began a job with the London Middlesex Health Unit as a family home visitor. She would work with a newly arrived family into Canada that needed help finding resources, maybe a new mother feeling overwhelmed, needing a helping hand or some encouragement and guidance. Sadly, she was not able to do this for long. She was strong yet delicate, confident yet so humble, kind and so wise. She was a loving daughter, sister, mother, grandmother, teacher, and caregiver. She was so much to so many people. She was my best friend and my hero. In 1999, Mama took us to live in Lebanon for 2 years. My father stayed behind in Canada. If he left, he wouldn't be eligible for his disability compensation that he was receiving. We lived in a small village for those 2 years. We connected to our heritage, language, community, and country. When we returned to Canada in 2001, my father's behavior was extremely controlling and erratic. He would have many bad days where he would control what we did. We would turn the home phone ringer off to silent, and we would hope no one would randomly stop by. He wouldn't allow Mama to work and controlled our spending and lives. My sister and I weren't allowed to join any extracurricular activities at school. He would sometimes cause scenes or display this behavior in front of his siblings or other members of the community, and then we would be held accountable by the community. My aunt would come to ask me, why did your father do that? We started to isolate ourselves. We would feel dread at any community event. What if he embarrasses us again? The community also started to leave us out of things. Our uncles would rent a hall and have a gathering to celebrate Eid, or to go for the day to Niagara Falls or Canada's Wonderland and not invite us. If our relatives from out west or from Lebanon came to visit, they would not inform us. So again, we made the best of our situation. We continued our "we can do this" attitude, surviving and waiting until he would change, disappear, or die. 2 years before the murder, my father had tried to break Mama's neck. My sister and I pulled him off of her. We called our uncles for help, as they had expressed that they wished we would have done that instead of calling the police in 2005, and they sent their sister to our home to tell us that they did not want to get involved. As my aunt left, my sister told her if they did not help us, someone would leave our house in a body bag, and it would probably be Mama. She asked my uncles to meet with her later in the week, but they stood her up. My father had always been unemployed, and Mama, my sister, and I always worked to support the household. Was it fair that we have to leave our home because he was a horrible person? I used to try to think of ways to make him leave. My head would hurt trying to think of a solution. None of the solutions were fair. Should my parents get divorced? Should we go to a women's shelter? Should we all move out and leave him? Would he follow us? All of the solutions I could think of resulted in us giving up everything and still living in fear. I want to mention here the option of divorce. While it's permissible in our religion to divorce, culturally it's shameful. A girl from a broken home will have more difficulties getting married, and this is an important part of traditional societies. So this was a major cultural barrier to us leaving. My father had a therapist he saw monthly or quarterly for over a decade. He was diagnosed with clinical depression and needed to see the therapist to get prescriptions for his medications. A few weeks before the murder, Mama called the therapist to tell him that things were getting bad in our home and asked him if he was getting any indication of other issues my father may have been having. He told her that my father never spoke at his sessions. He would remain silent for the hour, take his prescription, and leave. I wonder where was his due diligence. The therapist told Mama, if he ever gets violent, just call the police. But what if he was too violent, and what if it was too late to call the police? In April 2012, our worst fear was realized. He was too violent. And when my sister and I returned home from our friends on the night of the 11th, it was too late. Mama was by the door, stabbed 25 times, and bled out to death. I hope that sharing my experience with you shines a new light on how to work with and help families in similar situations as ours. The situation is very complex, and culture and background is a very important aspect to be sensitive to. In the words of the justice that sentenced my father to 25 years in prison for the crime of second-degree murder, you have every right to be angry. Anger is not necessarily a negative emotion. We need anger to make sure we defend those who are defenseless. We need anger to motivate us to change people's impressions of domestic violence and to end complacency. So anger, hang on to it, but make it a good anger. Make it a positive anger. Thank you.
So, and with that, we're going to ask Abir Al-Jamal to come forward and say a few words about the challenges of working with people in immigrant and refugee communities who are experiencing domestic violence. Very pleased to say that Abir has been with us on this project since it started in 2015, and she's been an excellent resource as well as her organization, the Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration, working with us on this project. So we really welcome and thank you, Abir.
Thank you. I will start saying that Maha spoke about anger and turning anger into a positive one. I totally agree with her and will join her to say, let us utilize this anger to do productive work. Immigrants and refugee populations are diverse. They have unique lived experiences and migration journeys. Understanding domestic violence within these communities require a framework that recognizes their diversity. One might question that immigrants and refugees may share commonalities like language, religion, country of origin, and such. Yes, I agree, but I would give you example that not every Arabic-speaking person is an Arab or identify themselves as so, and not every Spanish-speaking person identify themselves as Hispanic. One would say immigrants uphold collective culture and share the same value. I would disagree on that because culture are not static either or, they are fluid. Similarly, if we look at immigration and integration, there are various aspects that interplay on this level. For instance, within the refugee and migration categories, there are many, and each has its unique aspects and factors. While integration is a long two-way process where society and the immigrants and refugees work together towards this goal. Homogenizing immigrants and refugees communities, not recognizing their diversity, unique experiences, attributing violence to a certain culture, religion, is very problematic and creates structural barriers for victims to seek help. I would highlight some of the barriers facing immigrants and refugee women experiencing violence that impede them from seeking formal help and enhance their vulnerabilities. Many women fear being labeled as members of violent culture, religion, or families. This heightens their risk of victimization. Immigrants and refugees may face discrimination, which impact their experiences and also disclosure of violence. They would have concern regarding family breakdown, stigma, fear of sociocultural isolation, and exclusion. Victims want to live free of violence, but not necessarily leaving the relationship. They are fearful of losing their custody of their children, or maybe for their families in their countries of origin. They have language barriers, unaware of the laws, a lack of awareness about their own rights and the services available for them. They fear deportation, and they may experience financial hardship. They also lack or limited services that are culturally informed for victims as well as for perpetrators. These barriers are very, very few of many, many other barriers. If we want to speak about the risk factors of domestic violence among this population, we need to acknowledge that these risk factors are not linear and simple. They are very complex, intersecting, and multifaceted. They are unique, and we as service providers need to understand these factors within pre- and post-migration and family context, and not alone by themselves like the risks. It's very important to acknowledge that domestic violence among this population is rooted in patriarchy, emphasizing male dominance, control, and entitlement as any other culture or population. Understand their cultural background and consequently the family worldviews, gender roles, interaction, family values. Look how we can support women and children and give them voice while ensuring their safety. Engage perpetrators to interrupt violence and mitigate risk without excusing their behavior and over isolating them, because we all know isolating perpetrator would heighten risk of lethality. Understand the impact of pre- and post-migration on family that make their experience very complex and difficult. So we need to explore, listen, understand, and value their pre-migration journey. That we need to understand how the family lived in their countries of origin, what pushed them to leave their countries, understand their journey and respect that. Also, how they did leave and why they lived, what routes they took to reach other countries, and the transit countries that we call as the neighboring countries for refugee, while they stay there in the hope that countries would have peace to go back, or unfortunately that what's happening nowadays, they would be final resettlement. And in many instances, those refugees are waiting for the unknown because they don't know what's the process of resettlement, and even in many instances, they don't know the countries they are heading for. Another and last important thing is the post-migration, because they are safe. Yes, they are safe and having a new life. However, they are facing cultural variation, adjustment to a new context. Literally everything is new. They might have a language barrier and also need to learn new language. They are unfamiliar of the cultural norms and Canadian values and laws. They are also have decline in their status, and in many instances, they don't access the marketplace. Changes in gender role happen, also unresolved trauma, but we need to acknowledge that trauma is also not manifested in the same way in every individual exposed to trauma, and also not everyone exposed to trauma need help or he or she is violent. They have concern about their children losing their identities or leaving the family at a certain age, having full decision or having sexual relationships. They have also, we need, also to explore history of abuse. It's very important. It's not also that he's abusing her here. We need to understand when abuse started. So we as service provider, we need to acknowledge the people's journey. They are expert in their lives. However, due to the complexity and intersectionality of various factors that interplay as risk factors within the family context, working with immigrants and refugee population, we need to recognize, and this is very important, that one size does not fit all at all, due to their uniqueness of experiences, diversity, and thus our work need to be case by case. The Muslim Resource Center has celebrated recently our 10th anniversary, and we work always with families experiencing domestic violence, and believe me, these cases are very complex and difficult. Our work is innovative, and it is within the culturally integrative family safety response model. So the hope is that the broader community to come together and to continue to work on more research to inform risk assessment, risk management, and safety plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abir, for your comments and for all the work you've been doing over the last 10 years with your colleagues. I want to focus now on the next step in our research, having heard from Allison and Maha and Abir's comments. We're very much dedicated to go from just counting the numbers of homicides to really drilling deep and getting the voices of victims and survivors as to what they've been through and what could have been done to prevent the tragedy in similar circumstances in the future for others. I wanted to also say for the record that we're focused on 4 vulnerable populations. I want to be very clear, and I was thinking about this when Abir was speaking. We're not focused on Indigenous, immigrant, rural, remote, and children, because we believe those populations somehow represent being more violent. But what we do say is when they do experience violence, they have less access to resources. There's a number of barriers that are culture, language, access to resources that make it difficult to get help on a timely basis. So I want to be clear when we talk about this, we're not talking about one of these populations being more violent, but we're talking about populations when there is violence, they have less access to resources on a timely basis and may remain in situations that are dangerous for their short-term and long-term well-being. Our research is moving into reaching out to survivors. So we're looking at family members and friends who have lost somebody to domestic homicide and would like to share their story, have their insights as to what happened and what might have happened differently, with hindsight looking back as to what might have led to different outcomes. We're also looking to survivors of severe domestic violence who survived because of supports that might have been informal or more formal, police, social agencies, mental health professionals. We're looking at survivors, and we're looking to their stories as to how they survived. So part of our hope for today's press conference is to put out the word that we are now looking for people to become part of the study, and we're really looking at the voices of survivors and friends and family who lost somebody to domestic homicide. Obviously, we're looking at the subpopulations in terms of Indigenous, rural, remote, northern communities across the country, immigrant and refugees, and also children exposed to domestic violence who were at risk for domestic homicide or survived high-risk situations. To be part of the study, you have to be 18 years of age or older. We are offering an honorarium for their time in the interview at $50. We're also covering transportation and childcare costs. So we're trying to make the interviews, we're going to do it by phone or in person or by Skype. So we're open to a number of avenues. We're not looking at somebody contacting us who's in the middle of a dangerous situation. We hope that they go to a shelter, call the police, or seek assistance. We're looking at cases that date back to 2016 and earlier. So we're looking at over a 10-year period to people who are currently in a safe place, and ideally individuals who have supports in place and want to share their insights and their story with our research team. And obviously we're looking at individuals who are no longer part of any formal court proceedings. We have a central contact, our project manager, Annalise Stratman. Email address, 1-800 number will be our first point of contact in terms of screening, and then we have a number of interviewers across the country who are prepared to be part of these interviews. Actually, just to plug for our own faculty, we have 4 PhD students on the verge of graduating who are prepared to be involved in these interviews and have clinical experience, as we have research graduate students across the country. I should indicate that I'm here today representing myself and Myrna Dawson from Guelph in terms of the Ontario initiative, but we have co-investigators from coast to coast to coast. So as we speak and as you see Annalise's contact information, there are similar press conferences in Yellowknife with contact information for that area, as well as Winnipeg, Fredericton, and Montreal. So we have Quebec partners prepared to obviously do the interviews in French, and we're prepared from coast to coast to coast to start welcoming potential interviewees. Annalie, anything major I left out that I know? At this point, I could open the floor briefly for questions, and then look at, after that, looking at more informal, and anyone's welcome to talk to Allison or Abir or Julie or Annalie, or Jordan also has been part of this project since the beginning, so we're prepared to answer questions informally. Any large group questions, any thoughts, reflections, clarification? Jane Sims, London Free Press. I thought you'd be in the courthouse waiting for a verdict today.
Not me, it's my colleague Greg.
Okay.
What exactly will you do with the information that you collect from the people that you know interview? I know that the purpose is to try to better understand why this is happening amongst these areas. We get lots of times when we have research happening that becomes over.
Right.
Tell me what your expectations.
That's a great question, and we hope a lot will come out of it. And our hope is that we're looking at least 200 interviews across the country. We are hoping to transcribe all the interviews and then look for patterns across the country. So our particular interest will be looking at what are the unique risk factors, what are, for example, for the homicide victims, for family members, what attempts were made in terms of contacting the police, social service agencies, mental health professionals. The big question for us, were there missed opportunities? Were there, in our experience, there are now 7 death review committees across the country, Ontario and 6 other provinces. And in general, what the research suggests, in 80% of the cases, there are 7 or more well-known risk factors, such as a previous history of violence and separation, access to guns. So we're looking at 2 things. What are the unique risk factors in those cases? And who knew what when? Is this an issue in terms of lack of support from formal agencies, or is this a lack of understanding of friends, family, neighbors, and co-workers? So our hope is to transcribe the interviews and then look at those patterns and also recommendations. Also looking at survivors, where people did get help on a timely basis. What was the key? Was it informal or formal supports? So we're looking across all sectors: health, justice, social service, informal community supports. And just give you a particular example, one of the things we're finding in the research is that the highest rate of domestic homicide involving guns is actually in rural communities. So one of the things we're looking at is to what extent is there awareness about the presence of guns, the association with suicide or homicide suicides, and making sure we're doing everything we can to look at, and that's part of Alison's story, looking at what are we doing in terms of access to weapons and restricting access to weapons for those cases. So we're looking, and for example, Indigenous communities, what is there in terms of having resources available on a timely basis, especially in rural remote resources. So those are some of the factors that we'll be looking at. Who do we tell? So the funding has come from SHRC, and the findings will go everywhere. So we have our website, CDHPI. We have many partners. Elsa, beside you, might tell you exactly the number of people that follow the research that comes out, but we'll certainly be sharing everything with both the federal government, the key ministries in terms of justice and health, and we'll also be sharing it with provincial governments. So every one of our co-investigators is obviously connected with their provincial or territorial governments to share findings, because at the end of the day, one of the things that is true more than anything else is domestic violence is everyone's business. So it's no longer, in the old days we thought somehow the police were going to fix it or the courts were going to deal with it, and we realized it's got to be the workplace, it's got to be friends and family, it's got to be the psychologist or social worker who's seeing somebody for counseling, who identifies risk factors. It has to be everyone's business, so clearly we'll be dealing with multiple ministries to share the findings. Alison, you want to maybe grab the mic?
Sure. If I may add one comment that in my state of emotion looking at my daughter's photo I forgot to mention, which was a critical point. The reason that I mentioned that my daughter was going to school in a rural community and how that played a role in her murder was that it enabled her killer to find out where she was living. Because although she was living in a room in a house, she was renting a room in a private home in Bracebridge. And the university being a small campus, and I'm sure the university community here can relate, he was able to find her car in the parking lot. And that was how he was able to stalk her and find out how she lived. And she actually had a plan to go to the University of Windsor. She had applied for her master's social work. And part of our plan was that if she was able to get accepted into Windsor, in the Windsor-Detroit large metropolitan area, he would never be able to find her. So I just wanted to make sure the media in attendance in reporting this story understands that that was the point I was making about Bracebridge. And by the way, the community of Muskoka has been absolutely wonderful in the 6 years since her death. She wasn't from their community, but they have adopted her as their own. There is a walk a mile in her shoes every year that started as a result of her death. There is a very large monument in Bracebridge Waterfront Park to my daughter. And by the way, other victims of domestic gun violence in Muskoka that Peter and I know about, there have been at least 4 that we know of since my daughter's murder in Muskoka, all with legally owned guns. So I wanted to make that point very clear. Thank you.
And Alison, not to put words in your mouth, legally owned guns that for the most part should have been removed based on prior threats to do harm or self-harm. So these are things in terms of firearms that are really important. And again, I know this is a hot debate currently about long guns and handguns, and we often see that as an urban issue. The reality, it's an enormous rural issue. And again, we're not talking about taking guns away from law-abiding citizens, but removing guns from people who threaten their partner or ex-partner and have a history of domestic violence. Other questions? I can maybe start, and Abir or Mohammed, if you have any comments, feel free to jump in. But I think the question you have is important, but I think the basic premise behind the question may be faulty unintentionally, because I think if anything, some of the research we've done suggests there's actually less violence in immigrant and refugee communities. There's a lot of pre-migration trauma and post-migration stresses, but in fact, we're not seeing more violence from immigrants than we are seeing from Canadian-born perpetrators. At the core is really, the patriarchal beliefs about men's ability to control their partner and their children and having the absolute power, including the power of life and death. And the issue is embedded throughout Canadian culture as it is in any other country where we have immigrants coming from. So it's a broader issue, and surprisingly, it's not more prevalent in immigrant communities. I think what's more prevalent is the pre-migration trauma, and also the stressors of adjusting and assimilating to a new country, new culture, finding jobs, education. Mohammed, anything, or Abir, anything you want to add, or is that okay? Seeing no other questions, I think we're happy to meet individually with media and also any interested parties. Again, I'd encourage you to speak with Alison, Abir, or Mohammed, particularly talking about immigrant populations and some of the innovative work that they're doing. Julie, Annalie, Jordan, and also Laura Alsway. Laura, do you want to wave your hand? Laura's a PhD student who is actively involved in doing research on this related to overlaps with children at risk and child protection. So please feel free to stay here and network with anyone you'd like to. Otherwise, thank you all for being here, and Alison and Abir, thank you for making your special efforts to be here and part of this press conference. Thank you.